Okay. So yeah, I'd just like to introduce Nemo. Though it's very difficult to introduce Nemo because Nemo is a heavyweight in the region, giant in the region. But we'll try to the best of our ability to introduce her, so that we can begin to get on with the session this evening. So Nemo is, one of those great debaters in the continent. She's done quite a number of tournaments. She's capped quite a few. She's done independent adjudication for a while, and overall, she's pretty good. She's pretty good in the field of, actually not pretty good. She's among the best in the field of debating in the continent. So we thought that there's no one else to try and help us improve adjudication in the region, because as Macharia Mukono was saying once upon a time, there's need for training. There's need for training in the region, so that we're able to improve judging ahead of the major tournaments that we're having. PUDC coming in December, EUDC coming in August, and a lot of other continental championships that are present. So with that, I guess I'd just like to hand over to Nemo to take us through this evening. Just comply with what she would like to tell you, to facilitate the session. And yeah, I'm looking forward to learning, to growing, and obviously becoming a better debater, better adjudicator. As one of my friends put it, actually, Mweni, I think she's in the crowd. It's for the debaters, especially the new novice speakers in the circuit, it's great for you to get this opportunity, because now you learn how to debate, but from the panel side, you're learning how to do this from the other side, from the lens of the person judging you. What are they thinking? How are they doing their metrics? How at the end of the day do we get that kind of ranking? So we learn all of these things today. So with that, Nemo, welcome.
All right. Thank you so much, Jeff, for that introduction. I'm just trying to locate my presentation. Just give me a few minutes. But before I do that, I think we'll be beginning first by discussing, or just to find out where everyone sort of is in terms of their judging journey. Have you ever judged before? Sorry about that. I have a cold. Have you ever judged before? What are some of the issues you face when judging? What are some of the myths you've encountered to do with judging? So we can just sort of have a discussion, and then we can build from there, so you can make it a very interactive session. 1 second. Okay, all right. So just to get maybe input from the crowd, what are some of the judging misconceptions or myths maybe that you've heard or that you'd like to question? Anyone?
Yes, I can start.
Okay, sure.
From the crowd. I think the first thing is that, or rather, the first thing I've encountered as a common misconception in judging is that you're supposed to use, okay, like let's say you've gone into a room, you have your own preconceptions, you have your own ideas concerning how the debate should have gone, and the debate didn't go like that. So at the end of the day, you come and rank, starting with the justification, and in your justification, you're like, you guys should have debated this, and this, but you didn't, and probably should have done that. And then I ranked. You find the judges ranking you off what you should have done rather than what you actually did, and that's one of the things I've encountered personally.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you for that, Jeff. Anyone else who like I think we'll just comment specifically on what Jeff was talking about. Sorry, speak, it's okay.
No, it's fine. So we're just talking about like myths related to judging, right?
Yeah. Yes, we're talking about
I'm just
myths.
asking because, yeah, okay. All right, cool. My connection is not
So
the
do you
best,
have any
yeah.
that
Yeah, I have just one I can start with. So I think the first myth is how much you need to insert yourself in the debate. I think the first thing people you think about judging is you're like the decider of the entire debate based on what you insert to the debate or what knowledge that you have. It's not really so much about what knowledge that you have or how you are in the debate. It's more like you just letting the debate play out and using any metrics in the debate given to like determine the winner of the debate. So it's not like you'd say, oh, this person ranks first because he uses this certain principle that I like. It's more how they argue. It's more you let the debaters argue what metric should be used. And then perhaps only in the case where no debater has inserted a metric, that's when you like insert yourself in the debate and use your own like knowledge. I hope that makes sense. So it's less about inserting yourself in the debate. It's more just about letting it play out.
Okay, yes, that makes a lot of sense. And maybe just to ask a small question in addition to that is if no debaters have contributed to the metric towards the debate and an adjudicator sort of wants to use their metric, what is the guiding factor? Is it that they just use their own logic? What exactly should they use to justify that metric?
So like an open question or to me directly?
Yeah, it can be to you. It's an open question generally.
That's a tough one. Let me hear what the rest think.
All right. Anyone else know or has a guess as to how exactly an adjudicator is supposed to determine that? You've not been given a metric by debaters. Hence, what do you do? Because you stated you're supposed to use the metric provided. So what happens when there's none?
I can try. In the case where there's no metric to be given, I think that just sometimes comes down to, I think, common sense. It doesn't always have to be the case that you go off, let's say, impacting like utilitarianism, like what debater's argument has the most impact, or I think it's just about like using common sense at that point. What maybe you use what they implicitly agreed upon. Like if one debater arguments are purely utilitarian and the other one tries to counter it with showing that no, we have more impacts or something like that, then I think you can use that metric because it is implicitly said. Even though it's not explicitly stated, it's what implicitly they all agree to. So I guess just that and sometimes common sense.
Okay, thank you for that. So I think it was nice to have a sort of like question answer kind of session because you're preempting, I think, a lot of conversations that we're going to have today. Moni, what do you think?
Okay, it's very similar to what Jeremiah has said, but I wouldn't particularly term it as common sense. I would say maybe as a judge, working with the assumption that you've understood the motion, which is, kind of part of your JD as a judge, you kind of help if the debaters haven't given you their own metric of, analyzing them against each other, you can maybe start by identifying the clashes in the debate. So what is clashing in opening? What is clashing in closing? Then also you could go around it by identifying the principles that are emerging from their speeches if they haven't already flagged the principles themselves.
Okay, thanks. Thank you for that. I think we're getting closer, or rather, we're getting more clarity specifically as to the kind of metric judges should be able to use. So, hold on, just give me one second. I'm trying to share the presentation, but I'm trying to use my laptop. So give me 1 second, because I realize if we don't necessarily have a presentation, then it just ends up being like a discourse, and there's a chance that some of you, will get lost within the discussion. Okay, but as I do that, just in the interest of time, we can go through the basic structure that I think we're going to be going through today. And confirm that you can all see my screen. We'll begin, I think, first with you. Generally, what is BP? Because I do understand we have some foundational speakers, judges here, and so okay. So generally, speeches are 7 minutes. Speakers can go up to 7 minutes and 15 seconds. And hence at 7 minutes and 15 seconds, judges are meant to stop writing, because at the end of the day, if you extend for different speakers, right, it means that they'll all push time limits, and hence you credit information that wasn't necessarily within the bounds. Generally, surpassing time or adjudicating to surpass, right, doesn't have a negative implication in terms of the speaker. Generally, also just shows maybe have less and some maybe speak highly content and based on like style and style but I'll say the rule names will get to rules contribute to
Nemo.
So this is what happens in terms of the debate. So usually it's a time, and so the class in second in
Excuse. Hi Nemo. I think your net is breaking.
I had the same concern.
Just give her a second as she tries to correct this.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Now it's better.
Okay. So basically, this is just as to how to conduct the debate, and this is not really like strong material when it comes to judging. It's just for those of you who are new, you can be able to at least follow how debate generally goes. So yeah, you can either choose to tap, other individuals choose to use the app to be able to signal timings, but at whatever extent, just know it's 7 minutes and goes up to 7 minutes and 15 seconds. Okay. Points of information. So points of information are generally questions that are raised towards the speaker on the floor. And this is usually done by speakers from the opposition side. So if prop is speaking, it will be done by op. If op is speaking, it will be done by proposition. So speakers are expected to take at least one POI, but again, you don't punish speakers if they don't necessarily take a POI. Sometimes their cases can be flooded, but it also contributes strongly to a speaker's speaker points if they're able to take a POI and address their POI within their speech. So POIs, one second. So POIs are asked. Sorry, I actually just woke up with the worst flu, but yeah. So POIs are only asked during unprotected time. Unprotected time generally operates from within the first minute and the last minute of speeches. So if a debate, given that a debate is 7 minutes, from 0 to 1 minute, you can't ask POIs. From 5 minutes to 6 minutes, you can't ask. From 6 minutes to 7 minutes, you can't ask POIs. So POIs can be asked from 1 minute to 6 minutes within the speech. POIs are supposed to be kept short and they're supposed to be limited to 15 seconds. Again, don't intrude on a speaker's time when they're taking POIs. And this is specifically to debaters and also for judges, right? Just make sure, especially if you're the chair, to call out a speaker if they're out of order, if they end up either asking a POI that's not guided and ends up exceeding 15 seconds, or isn't necessarily even asking a question, but is taking that time to like assert their case. Another thing is just also you have to observe the means as to how speakers ask POIs, in that just make sure that speakers are not badgering other speakers in the case of asking POIs. Okay. Okay. So info slides, and info slides are specifically something that's important when it comes to the aspect of motion analysis or motion reading, right? So as a judge, maybe you'd want to assume that it doesn't really matter for you to be able to, it doesn't really matter for you to be able to read or for you to be able to care about info slides or the motion, right? But there's, to a large extent, how a judge is supposed to adjudicate a debate based on what the motion is asking for, right? So there's a certain level of motion understanding that's required from judges. So information provided in the info slide should be assumed to be true for the purposes of the debate following it, right? So you go to debate where they'll be like, person X, right, has the ability, or the year is 2023. Oh no, yeah, we're close. The year is 2033. Scientists have developed a tool to be able to boost confidence within individuals, and they want to be able to apply this measure of confidence towards all individuals equally, right? That's your info slide. So what that means is that it's just trying to provide you with the background information of this tool that maybe scientists have developed, right? The motion will be something like, this house supports the implementation of this confidence boosting scheme, right? Specifically in school areas or something like that. So to that extent, right, it doesn't make sense for you to question whether it's possible to be able to have this motion device or anything like that, right? So to a large extent, a lot of like debaters, or if any proper op team tries to sort of come in and talk about how this is something that's not possible, right? Without necessarily engaging with the assumption that the info slide is true, then you realize that then that's severely mitigated, right? So it is a rule that you have to assume that whatever is in the info slide has to be assumed to be true, right? But also assumptions outside the info slide, right? If someone comes in, for example, a prime minister comes and adds that this confidence tool will be coupled or will also be will be channeled by another instrument or will be coupled with something else, right? That's a value. That's an addition that they've sort of tried to add. Hence, you don't necessarily have to defend that part as true, and that part can be questioned. Okay, so teams are allowed to provide additional definitions, clarifications, contextual information during the debate on top of whatever information is already provided within the info slide, right? Like in the info slide within schools, sorry, in the info slide within schools, right? Teams can be able to then go and define maybe what ages, right? They think that these kids in these schools are likely to fall within, right? And so long as it doesn't necessarily deviate from the mechanisms or from the actual motion or what the motion is asking for, right? So long as it's just providing an extra level of analysis, it's something that's allowed. Okay. So breaches of order. Breaches of order are generally things that are noted by chairs, but even then, right, I think a lot of like starting judges or debaters are going to either encounter this at one point or are going to end up being chairs, so it's something that they should know. So chairs are allowed to interfere in the chairs are allowed to interfere with the debate by calling order if in certain instances a speaker is either badgering or barracking another speaker. In that, you ask a POI and then you don't wait 10 seconds or maybe 15 seconds for that speaker to finish, and then you ask another POI and then you keep asking POIs, right? This is just generally known as badgering. It's rude, right? And at the end of the day, just you can be able to ask your POIs, but in a respectful manner also without necessarily disrupting the speaker on the floor. Okay. And I think also there are other rules in terms of breaches of order, especially when it comes to like online debates, which I think generally just fall within if an individual is trying to like disrupt the debate to a large extent. Yes, thank you. I think Kirago Kimani has just sent us an has just sent us an example of an info slide in a motion, just so you can become very familiar with it. Okay, 1 second. In terms of inconsistency in teams and benches, right? Other than the instance of clear misspeaking by the speaker, the argument made first should be considered by the stance of the team, and later arguments that contradict the first arguments should be discounted. So what this means, right, is that there are times, for example, the Prime Minister takes a stance, and to a large extent, they come in and the stance that they take is maybe contradicted by their second speaker, right? What judges are supposed to evaluate first is the level of analysis or argumentation that this line of that maybe this line of argumentation has taken, but also secondly, right, they can be able to also like further assert how relevant this is in terms of the material it contributes, right? But usually it's you weigh that first material as opposed to the second material, unless maybe the second material is like better evaluated and substantiated. In terms of benches, right, if for example, OG has a certain stance and CG comes to maybe have a completely different stance, right? Then what you can be able to do is assess based on who you think, right, has either better argumentation, has substantiated this more, and also thirdly, has been able to like prove impacts, right? So always, if you're measuring the value or the contribution of a certain element of a certain element of a speech or of a debate, right, it's always based on the value that it contributes either to the motion, and hence to that extent you're looking at the impact that it has. Okay. So generally, right, the judging objective, and this is something that's not necessarily as clear, but we'll get to it a bit later on, right? So generally, teams win debates by being persuasive with respect to the burdens on their side of the debate that they're trying to prove. And usually these are within the constraints of the set rules by BP. I think several questions arise from this, right? Where do we get burdens? How are burdens developed? How exactly do we weigh burdens as adjudicators? What happens maybe when there are no burdens? What do you look at, right? And we'll get to that later. So usually, right, we say that the judge should always view the debate from the perspective of an ordinary intelligent voter. And I think this is the issue that Jeff was raising, I think, in the preliminary stage before we began. And he was talking about how, to a large extent, right, what an ordinary intelligent voter is, right? It's between a spectrum. One, you don't necessarily have specialist knowledge of a certain topic, right? But also you're not necessarily completely unintelligible to that topic. In that, right, there's an expectation that maybe if we're talking about the motion is about the situation between Russia and Ukraine, right? We don't expect you, for example, to tell us intricate details about how maybe the Russian intelligence works, or the Russian intelligence works, or to be able to use that knowledge to a large extent, right? But I think we expect you as an adjudicator, right, to just know the basic metrics, for example, that generally come from the issues being discussed within the debate. Okay, so what this means yeah, so what this is, right, is that the ordinary intelligent voter has the sort of knowledge you'd expect from someone who regularly reads, but not necessarily memorize, in that you don't necessarily know intricate things or specialized things, right? They are, in short, a smart person who has a good deal of knowledge that is broad rather than deep. Imagine a bright and reasonably well-read university student who's studying a subject completely alien to any topic that would help them understand the debate in question. So to that extent, you're not completely not versed, but also you don't necessarily know intricate things, right? So what that means, right, is that you can't necessarily be able to hold the standards of a debate to your specialist or to your knowledge. You can't necessarily be able to hold the standards of a debate, right, to your intricate knowledge, and this just has to be based on the general knowledge that you have from that you generally have, right? This hypothetical ordinary intelligent voter doesn't have preformed views on the topic of the debate and isn't convinced by sophistry. Deception, or logical fallacies. Does not take into account political or personal beliefs when judging, right? So this second part is specifically crucial, right? Especially when it comes to maybe philosophical debates, or generally debates that have to do with a lot of identity aspects, right? So if it's identity politics kind of debates, if you're a woman, you don't necessarily perceive them, right, from the perspective of, for example, a female woman a female adjudicating, right? But just as a general person who's not likely to be swayed or to be influenced by any of by any intricate dealings or knowledge, right? This generally also applies to geographic, cultural, national, or ethnic background, especially when it comes to adjudicating. And also it's in terms, and this is specifically on an international level, right? It's also used especially when it comes to preferencing arguments or styles of speaking that generally come from your region, right? So this might not necessarily apply to us as much, but usually it happens. You'll find that when maybe you're not debating within Kenya or you're not debating within Africa, right? You'll find that they have a very different style or a different way of debating, right? And maybe they'll prioritize and maybe they'll prioritize that in terms of either listening to you, or maybe you'll be able, or maybe as an adjudicator, right, who's new to that space, you might try to prioritize that without necessarily looking at the different cultural context that's come into play, right? So you can have teams, for example, OG is from India, OO is from China, CG is from Britain, and CO is from America, right? So you're having people from very diverse backgrounds, but again, it's very subconscious, or sometimes it can be very objective to just try to prioritize certain maybe ways of speaking as opposed to others, right? And this is something that an ordinary intelligent voter generally does not tend to prioritize. I think we've dealt with this extensively. We can then be able to move. Okay. So things that don't matter when it comes to adjudicating in BP, right? The first is the number of arguments the speaker makes. I think when we're beginning to debate, we used to come up with 9 arguments, so you can just flood an adjudicator, and so you don't necessarily have to end up proving those arguments. You're
Is it just me or?
No.
No, I think Annette has dropped.
Give her a second. I hope you guys are learning something. I think she's back. Nemo?
Okay.
Yeah.
So just generally, right? So you try to flood like an adjudicator with so many arguments, so you look like you know more about the topic, but you don't end up fulfilling the elements of analysis, argumentation, and even impacting a lot of these arguments, right? So on a value base, what you've just made is that you stated claims, but these claims to a large extent don't impact the debate in any way. The second thing that doesn't really matter is how clever or innovative the argument is, right? So what that means is that sort of contributes to the, if it's well impacted, right, it contributes to the strength of argumentation, right? But at the end of the day, right, regardless of just face value, right, how clever or innovative that argument in itself is something that's not necessarily weighed. That also applies for like how interesting the argument was. Again, interest is not necessarily something that either like clashes or wins the debate to a large extent. And lastly is arguments that you're aware of, but which weren't made, right? And this is specifically towards adjudicators, because sometimes I mean, like, I think we've entered debates where maybe we're talking about, I think it's that time when there was this trend of like making a lot of debates specifically about the Super League, right? And so a lot of debates were, oh, we support the Super League being formed, blah, 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 blah. And I mean, a lot of like adjudicators do care about these things, right? And they know so many things about FIFA and they know so many intricate things about football. And so you go into that debate thinking how, you know, you already have, maybe if you support the Super League, right, you already have like certain arguments that you expect to hear about why the Super League is something that's like completely amazing and it will revolutionize like football, right? But you don't necessarily end up hearing them. You can't penalize the speaker for that. That has no weighing or like substantive contribution within the debate, right? More so that will just prove how biased you are because you're judging a debate based on factors that were not within the debate. And remember, the scope of judging has to be within arguments that have been presented. Okay. So this last sentence, right, what it means is that it's what's important, right, is how is the conclusion that the argument seems to make as to how it's proven like certain patterns within this debate, right? So I think this is just even in looking at argumentation structure, right? You can make a claim, but so long as you don't analyze the claim and you don't tell or you don't impact why, for example, that argument is something that's very like good or why it's something that's like completely important within the debate, right? You haven't really shifted any like nexus within the debate, right? You've just told us something. You haven't necessarily proven the impact that it has, right? So that's why it says it's how important its conclusion is to the debate. And I think this is something that we never really used to adjudicate on. I think in the African circuit primarily before 2000, I think 2020, right? We just used to like be, oh, so long as someone made an argument, we're going to credit that argument. Doesn't matter the level of argumentation, response, how responsive the argument is, or even like how severely they've impacted the argument. So these are all things that materially count, right, as to how strong an argument is. Okay, I think we've talked about this aspect of style. So style only matters, right? And this is something that's, I think, even in the World's Manual, that to a large extent, right, style only contributes where to a large extent a speaker was maybe like, you can credit a speaker for style where they were completely like clear and they were completely coherent. And even when you look at like the speaker scale coming in terms of BP, right, you'll be able to see certain indicators that do indicate style within the certain brackets. I think secondly is that it's generally, it clearly and precisely conveys the speaker's meaning, right? So you can be able to add style on that or deduct from that, right? But again, you can't look at an accent. You can't look at, for example, you can't look at an accent, you can't look at like other external factors, right? They have to relate specifically to the presentation of the argumentation and the strength of the argument, right? If someone effectively, for example, is able to convey like emotion, if they're able to like add in like certain things that are very if they're able to like add in, for example, certain aspects of speech that are very like persuasive, right? That you can be able to credit to style, but to a large extent, this generally has nothing to do with like subjective matters such as like accents and everything. Okay. So weighing frameworks. And I think after this, maybe we can open for questions so that we don't end up like just having a speech going on. So weighing frameworks, teams will often dispute the criteria by which the round should be adjudicated on. And I think this is, what Shama was talking about, and argue that points should be judged according to certain frameworks and standards. This is permitted. Teams are allowed to debate what criteria should be used to assess whether policy is good as part of arguing that it is, in fact, good. Judges should adjudicate this debate about criteria. They should not just apply their own preferred criteria. They should adjudicate on the following basis. So this is where like now the criteria comes as to when you're going to say, or when you're weighing why you think, for example, a certain team contributed in a certain way or another. So generally you look at, firstly, is there a certain criteria that generally teams explicitly agreed that that's the criteria through which the debate should be won, right? So is the goal, for example, to both teams are saying at the end of the day, we're both trying to save the most number of lives, and hence what we dispute on is how to be able to win the number of, to save a number, to save lives. So to that extent, I think it makes it slightly easier for an adjudicator, right? You can just be able to then say, given the fact that you both concede that this is the metric, right? We think then that OG was able to prove 1, 2, 3, 4, OO was able to prove preservation of life in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. CG was able to prove this in 1, 2, 3, 4, and CO was able to prove it in certain ways, right? So you don't just justify by saying, we think these people won, right? What is the criteria? How did the teams prove, or how did the teams win this specific criteria? If like there's not one criteria or principle that all teams implicitly agree is true and important, so if there's not necessarily one criteria that teams concede, right, but you can read by like the logic of their argumentation, right, from the motion, that they're all trying to say that this is our end, right? So for example, OG's impacts all lead towards maybe sustainable healthcare to save more lives and all that, or OO's argumentation maybe leads towards maybe better access to like certain things, which is also towards like the preservation of life, right? Then you can't be able to justify where you're getting that criteria from, because it wasn't necessarily explicit, it was implicit in their argumentation, right? So that's the second way. The third way, right, is and the third way specifically depends on, now in this case, teams to a large extent haven't agreed that there's a specific criterion, but there are certain different stances, right? So OG is saying that, look, we think that the preservation of life is something that's completely important on our end. OO is saying that, look, we need to consider other factors, specifically when it comes to we need to consider other factors, and the preservation of life is not necessarily something that should be like the ultimate goal, right? It's just like a small factor, and it's not necessarily the most important, right? So there's a conflict as to which criteria should be used to determine who wins the debate. So Shama, I think this is where your question was mainly provided for. A judge in this case should not come in and say, look, I think preservation of life is obviously more important, hence we think that's the metric, right? That's not necessarily the best form, or what that would be, right, is that you'd be using, for example, some sort of like implicit knowledge or some sort of implicit bias, right, to be able to justify that. Because at the end of the day, what makes maybe preservation of life something that's way more grand if there's no like probable criteria metric, right? And this is why we say everything in BP has to be proven. So if you're saying no teams have agreed on a certain criterion, teams are disputing a criterion, then what you have to say as an adjudicator, right, is which criterion you have chosen and why specifically you have chosen it, right? So you can be able to say that maybe we think that preservation of life in this case is the most important criterion, because proposition has been able to prove how this is something that either covers a larger scope of individuals, it caters for minority groups, it caters for like 1, 2, 3, the disenfranchised people. So it's how did they prove as a proposition, or how did they prove as government, right? Why their criterion is something that's like very important. And again, please make sure you don't use external factors to be able to qualify that criterion. It has to be specific factors that they have been able to like state or stipulate within the round. Where like this doesn't apply, right? And there's no general, like they haven't given you an explicit one, they haven't given you an implicit one, they're not disputing any form of criterion, right? What an adjudicator is supposed to do in this case, right, is you're supposed to generally take what you've heard within the debate, right, and then be able to then assess. So what happens then is that you have had, for example, different arguments, but you have had like different arguments, for example, spanning from preservation of life. You've had different arguments specifically focusing on different aspects, such as like providing for maybe equitable or sustainable growth and stuff like that, right? So what you do is that you'd then be able to say, this is the criteria I picked. No team exclusively, for example, highlighted this thing, right? If they didn't, but also justify then why that criteria that you picked is something that's important, right? We think it's important because teams substantially dealt a lot with this material. Teams in this case substantially like focused on this specific criteria, even though they didn't know, and they were able to prove it in certain ways. So always use material within the debate and don't tend to go like externally then to be able to like justify. Okay, so okay, so now we'll go into motion or types of motions and motion analysis, right? So generally we have policy motions. I think policy motions, you'll see them in this House will, and it's just generally asking for either something to be implemented or for some sort of action to be done, right? What generally happens, right, is that in this case, there has to be some sort of mechanisms that are established. So if Gov sets up a mechanism, right, then they can be able to flow with that. But also, depending on just the type of motion, either the motion asks for a counter mechanism from up, then they can be able to develop one. But if it's not really necessary, it's not really necessary. They can also almost always just defend the status quo, or just maybe generally or oppose the mechanism that generally exists within proposition side. So what a fiat means, and I don't know if you've heard that, right, is that usually proposition teams have a power of fiat. What this means is that, for example, when a motion says something such as, this House would, yeah, I'm trying to sound politically correct. Yeah, this House would invade Syria, right? For example, what this would do is, what a fiat would be is that you have to assume that to a large extent, right? Prop has fiat that this is something that's possible to limit maybe the scope of opposition just focusing their arguments on like, this is not something that's possible, right? So they can be able to establish then their mechanism to be able to do this, and then Op can be able to like challenge maybe the setup of that mechanism, but they can't necessarily be able to just say, look, we don't think this is possible. Prop has the fiat to be able to assert that motion. Okay. Types of motion and analysis. This House believes that that's a need to convince of the truth of the statement. It's not a policy, hence it's just it's a value-based debate, right? We want to know the reasons why, and we want to know the reasons why. Yes, we just want to know the reasons why. We don't really focus specifically on the mechanisms you want to use to achieve a certain end. This House supports or opposes. This is where government needs to argue that they would either symbolically, politically, materially, or in some other manner support the person, group, institution, cause, idea, value, or statement. So here it's, you can do a policy, or you can choose not to do a policy, right? So what can happen is that you can say this House chooses to support, like, for example, a certain system, right? You can be able to say that then this support is something that would maybe just be to a monetary level, or would be limited to a certain scope, and then elaborate on that, but also then substantially deal with the value aspect of the debate, right? This is not something that's primarily a policy. This House prefers is also now necessary to compare the status quo, right? So this House prefers, it's so this house prefers, right? You'd have to take maybe the current world and compare it with what this house prefers. And hence, many times opposition in this case usually has to defend the status quo in order to like take this stance. Or sometimes the motion can even give you a counterfactual. So it prefers this over this. Or, but if it doesn't necessarily give you the two options, you can still be able, to have the word. Sorry, 1 second. So this house believes that X should do Y, that X should do Y. So this is a neutral, like observer kind of motion where you can establish a policy if you'd want, if you feel like that's what's necessary to be able to prove your argumentation. But also judges, you can't necessarily penalize in this case for individuals not necessarily having a policy, because again, it still has some sort of like value-based debating necessary given the fact that it's a this house believes motion. So this house as X would do Y. What this is what these are, right? Or what this is an actor motion. Actor motions are specifically important for two reasons, right? Because the impacts or whoever wins the debate has to cater towards the actor. What this means is that you can be able, for example, to have maybe it's this house as, I think this is usually, I think, even done in a lot of political spaces, right? So for example, this house as Biden would seize all peace talks with Russia, right? To a large extent. So what this is that to a large extent, you can't be arguing that maybe it's not for the benefit of Russia, it's not for this and this benefit, right? All arguments have to be shifted towards why this is something that's beneficial for Biden and the United States maybe, right? So every single impact that you're going to accrue, right? You have to show why this is something within Biden's interest. If you're going to show that, if you, for example, you want to say that this is not necessarily going to be good for Biden's allies, right? Why should Biden care about his allies? You have to justify that aspect to be able to say that then this is not good for Biden's allies because he mainly depends on them for a lot of support, blah, 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 right? So it has to have the link towards how this specifically affects the person. And as an adjudicator, justice is a metric in order to analyze actor motions, because some debaters just generally tend to give a lot of arguments, but in actor motions, if you don't relate it back to how this affects the main actor, then a lot of those arguments just end up being less strong and highly like irrelevant. Okay. Okay, so role fulfillment, right? So this is something that's necessary, but again, it's not necessarily something that's going to win you a debate. So yes, you need to define the motion. Yes, you need to do like a lot of establishment, especially as an opening team, and you have to do like a lot of foundational aspects. But again, not doing this is not an automatic fourth. Also, I mean, yeah, not doing this is not an automatic fourth, as to a large extent, role fulfillment within BP is just to stick within maybe just the ambits of the debate, but not necessarily as like a strong coercive factor as to how you're going to win or lose, right? It's like very minimal. It just guides us to like the formalities of the debate. In terms of like member of government and member of opposition, there's a requirement that you need to extend, and hence it will substantially impact your contribution to the debate if you don't have like clear material, clear unique material coming out, right? But also it's not an automatic fourth. It doesn't necessarily mean that because if you don't have an extension, then you can't necessarily win, right? You still have to be weighed according to other teams within the debate. Yes. So again, no such thing as automatic fourths. That's never something that's applied. Okay, so I think this is something that we can maybe just skip through, but in terms of definitions by the Prime Minister, right? So the Prime Minister can remove anomalous examples. Geez. Okay, so what this means, right, is that in a motion, it's like legitimate for OG to exclude like anomalous examples, right? So in the case where you want to say we're banning cosmetic surgery, like the motion says, right, OG can be able to say that, look, we exclude burn victims because to a large extent, they don't fall within the scope of like, if we're to have like a value-based debate, right? Because for them, it's going to be necessary. And we think that the scope that burning cosmetic surgery generally applies to is we're talking about a very like different scope, right? However, in like the opposite, right? It's not like, it's not good practice, right? Or it's not allowed to, for example, say if we're banning cosmetic surgery, to say that it only applies for children, right? You're limiting the scope too narrow, and you just want to have, for example, a favorable debate to yourself, and you don't want to engage with the full aspects of why, for example, engage with the full burden of banning plastic surgery. Okay, so generally, just side notes, you can't play with time or place it. So you can't be like, yeah, we're moving this debate to 1979 before computers existed. Hence, in a debate for cybercrime, we think that all your harms are like slightly like, non-operational to a large extent, right? That's not allowed. So, squirreling, challenging definitions, right? Squirreling unfairly limits the scope of the debate. So if a team challenges a definition, right, they must be able to argue that the definition is illegitimate and explain why. So again, like all ambits of BP, right? It's not enough to make a stance and say that that definition in itself is not value. You have to then justify why then that's not something that you can be able to debate and why you're challenging it, right? And hence you have to do the best form to defend why that definitional challenge, right, is something that's so strong, just so you make sure maybe that you're not challenging a good definition that exists, right? So secondly, you can challenge a definition and you can choose to redefine it. However, it's not really necessary. You can just be able to like challenge a debate, right? I mean, you can just be able to like challenge a definition, but again, you have to justify. Okay, so I think before we continue, any questions, just so we don't have like continuous talking.
Any questions, guys? Any questions? Personally, I have two, not from this section, but from earlier sections that you had mentioned.
All right.
Okay. So the first one is on the last section that we've just tackled right now, concerning role fulfillment. Now, you said that ideally it's not necessary. It's not a necessary criterion to have to win, to have fulfilled your role extensively. However, what happens if like it was necessary, like it was that if you had fulfilled your role, perhaps it would have given you the team a better advantage. So let me give you an illustration so that it makes a bit more sense. So let's say you're opening government and you limited the debate. Actually, this happened in I think it should be Mashuja 7. Opening government limited the scope of the debate. It was a debate about corporations. Opening government limited the debate to state corporations themselves, right? But on this other side, the idea from the people who crafted the motion and from CAP ideally was that the types of corporations were supposed to be endless. It was about whether corporations should be given the authority to run government, or rather to replace the government in instances of crisis. So if the prime minister actually fulfilled their role properly and gave the correct context or the correct setting in which we were supposed to be debating in, then automatically, probably CG would have had better impacts. Probably the harms that opposition had would have probably had an opportunity to materialize even heavier. So what do you do in that instance where it is literally, the defect of the definition probably quote unquote ruined the motion or ruined the analysis of the motion? What do you do in that space as the chair or as the panelist?
Okay, so two things, right? You can't also just you can't also really just as an adjudicator, right, say that that's inherently like squirreling or anything like that, right? This has to be sorry. This has to be raised by raised by one of the teams debating. Hence, if it's up, for example, they should be able to question how that's not necessary, or how that limits the scope within debating, and then be able to justify that. But again, what happens when maybe the opposition doesn't necessarily seem to challenge that, and then they continue to maybe fall through or to continue with that debate, right? What you do is that you then can't come as an adjudicator and say that, no, OG, if the rest of the house went with that definition and was able to debate that definition, fine. I think from the position of an adjudicator, right, you can recognize, but also you judge the debate as it is, regardless of what other views, even though like valuable, even though whether those views to a large extent are like valuable. But to a large extent, maybe you can give it in terms of feedback. But if that sort of setting or definitional limiting is not challenged by any other team, right? It limits the scope of what the adjudicator can do if all other teams within the debate are just going to go along, for example, with that line of argumentation.
Okay, I have a second one, but a coach also had raised this hand. So now this is probably the first few slides when you were talking about inconsistencies in teams and benches. So you had said something, okay, I'd like you to clarify something about like how do we deal with that inconsistency where the Prime Minister has come and said this, and the Deputy Prime Minister has come and more or less contradicted the whole argument on that other side. So whose matter do you weigh more?
So how generally the rule goes, right, is that you look at the first contribution, right? But that's also not enough. What you can do is you look at who was able to justify more, right? So even if they contributed, for example, even if they contradicted their first speaker, but they were able to justify why maybe their stance is something that was valuable, right? You can be able to then go with the one with the stronger justification, because again, BP is about value judgment. Have they been able to justify why then their stance is something that's much stronger? However, this will impact their speaker points or their team points, specifically when it comes to the ambit of strategy, because it will mean that maybe you only had value addition within the debate coming from one team, from one member of a team, as opposed to coming from both speakers of a certain team.
Thank you. Akoto, I think you had a question as well.
My question has already been answered. It was just on like how opposition can challenge the framing, but by legitimizing it. So it already answered that.
Oh, thanks. Anyone else with questions? Just ask, man. This is an opportunity for you guys to get to learn, to get to explore this thing. Any questions so far? I guess, Nemo, you can continue. People are satisfied. So, yeah.
Right. So I think we're about to conclude, right?
We actually have one from Joyce. Just go ahead.
My question is, when you were talking about the don'ts in arguments, you said that you don't have to actually check on how interesting the argument was. So what would distinguish one debater from another? What style would distinguish them? Maybe some people have the points, but how they put it out, even you can't be able to pick it because they don't have a style that you don't want even to follow up on.
Well, that's the thing about BP, right? Style matters substantially less than your contribution in terms of the value you have to a debate, right? So if, for example, a speaker is maybe a new speaker, but they have very strong arguments, right, to proving maybe the motion as to proving, let me look at the chart, one of the motions. Yeah, maybe this house would require all defendants in criminal cases to be represented only by state-employed lawyers. So if that speaker is justified and they have really strong stances as to why that having that representation by state lawyers is something that would be able to impact justice in the most beneficial way, right? Then, that would be able to impact justice in the most beneficial way. it would be able to cater for people who also come from disenfranchised communities, so it can maybe equalize the criminal justice system, right? And they have really strong argument, but their presentation is poor. What you do, right, is that they can maybe be slightly lower when it comes to if their arguments weren't clear. And I think we went through style, right? It's whether their arguments weren't clear, whether they were vague, whether they weren't coherent, right? But they were still, to a certain extent, strong. So they fall within a different bracket of adjudication, right? But they can't outweigh, but a team who has less strong arguments, but really good style can't outweigh the team with stronger arguments. It's all about the value judgment being added to the debate. So yes, fine, they can have like really poor style, and that will reflect maybe in the speaker scores, but it can't necessarily reflect in the call. Yes. Okay, have I been able to answer your question, Joyce?
Yes, you have. Thank you.
Okay, all right. You're welcome. So I think we can now be able to move on, right? So we can look at how to weigh or how to adjudicate extensions by MG and MO. So an extension can take several forms. The first is in terms of new arguments which have not yet been made in the debate. So these are arguments that are completely new, either new angles, new directions. If we're talking about like the social context of something, someone comes to talk about how we haven't looked at the economic aspect, and hence justify to us why the economic aspect is something that's like completely important, for example, coming in from member. Two is in terms of like new rebuttals to material raised by the other side. So this is usually like very strategic, right? So sometimes a debate can not necessarily have the widest scope in terms of addressing closing themes. But what speakers can do is that they can be able to key or pick in certain like key rebuttals, for example, coming in from the opposition team, and they can be able to frame this as like, and they can be able to engage with this and then frame them as their material. So this is in fact, or this does in fact count as an extension, given the fact that it has to be highly responsive, right, to the material that's raised within the debate. So it doesn't necessarily have to be completely new argumentation. It can also be new rebuttals. Okay. The third one is in terms of new examples or case studies. How this just generally functions is that maybe opening government was dealing a lot with hypotheticals and how like maybe the principles of how something should happen. And closing comes and tells you how, look, we need to look at the practical, and we think the practical is something that can be seen or that is well illustrated in like 1, 2, 3, 4 ways. And so they deal highly with this sort of like case study approach. So yeah, sorry, and they deal highly with this sort of like case study approach in the analysis. Yeah, sorry, in the analysis. So this also counts as an extension. The fourth is in terms of a new analysis or explanation of set of existing arguments. So an example of this, I think it's usually really hard to trace unless maybe you find unless maybe you see it within a debate, right? But maybe the argument can be, the argument proposed by OG can be in line of, we think that maybe if it's about youth representation and participation, right? So they say that, look, we think that youth participation and is important because these individuals are inherently like maybe part of society and hence they need to contribute or participate. But then maybe closing comes and says that like, look, yes, our argument is also youth contribution, right? However, we think we provide a new level of analysis or explanation in that we say that this youth participation is justified, right? Because they're most likely going to be impacted with policies of the future because they're going to outlive maybe the policymakers that exist now. Two, because they're most likely impacted by things such as like poverty, unemployment, and hence their disenfranchised group. So it's like the same argument, right? Which is youth participation, but a different level of analysis and a different level of explanation. A lot of like brilliant debaters tend to do this because sometimes like debates can generally just be done. You know, there's not much you can add in terms of like tangible material, but you can be able to like better analyze from like the closing. Okay, so fifth is in terms of new applications of existing argumentation. So if the member points out that one of their opening house arguments is able to defeat a new argument from the other, is able to defeat a new argument from the other side. Yeah. Okay, so so what this means, right, is that you maybe take your openings argumentation, right, to a level, but also, sorry, where you take in where you take in your openings argument to a certain level, right? And this argument is already existing to a certain level, but you use this to maybe defeat a different line or a different form of argumentation. So what you're doing is just that you're leveraging and impacting the arguments better when it comes to closing. So how this can generally just apply, I think, is especially in terms of like impact, right? So your member can be able, the opening can be able to just state an argument, but they don't impact how this directly affects the opposition's case or something like that, right? So you can better impact this argumentation and offer that new line of application, and hence that's also credit. So the sixth one is new criteria for judging the debate, or a new defense of existing criteria for weighing arguments, right? So we had talked about new criteria. So we had talked about criteria and weighing, right? So in this case, it's just you can either use the existing criteria, but also weigh things slightly differently. So you say that maybe the criteria in the opening half, right, was mainly based on accessibility, right? We think that fine, accessibility is good, right? But we think that it's only good if it's able to do 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So you add a new level of like weighing, or you even add a new criteria maybe and prove why that new criteria is something that's substantially important. So there's a really big gap, right? Or there's a really big space, right, to be able to weigh or to like substantially check contributions of of members, and of members within the debate. It's just that a lot of adjudicators tend to just narrow it down to like new arguments, right? Many adjudicators don't even count new rebuttals as a form of extension, or even like new examples or case studies, but it still falls within the realm. So what doesn't count? So what doesn't count, right, is when you say word for word, the repetition of the first half's material, or even if you just use different words, right, but you still have the same arguments that still have the same impact, and you haven't necessarily had any sort of value addition within the debate, then you don't have an extension. So rules to do with whip speeches. Whip speeches, generally, you're not allowed new argumentation. But there are a few things that don't count as new argumentation, and hence can still be able to be raised by whips, right? What this is like new defenses of arguments already made, right? So to that extent, you can be able to say, so to that extent, you can be able to maybe say that, look, in response to OO's team, we think that you've been told that that's something that's going to be like highly inaccessible, blah, 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 blah. But we think that also, in addition to like a lack of accessibility, it's also going to be inequitable. So that's a new defense, or that's a new response, right? And you hadn't necessarily had it before, but it's highly responsive. Hence, it still can be credited like as a valid engagement as a whip speaker. So new examples generally to support existing arguments, and I think even just to note, right, new rebuttals, new explanations, all this generally adds to, I think, the substantial impact maybe that a whip speech has to a debate, right? Because I think if a whip speech comes and they basically tell you rebuttals that you've already had before, if they keep like just telling you explanations that you've heard before, right, it's also not necessarily as strong. Sometimes they can be able to either add new engagements and new rebuttals, right, to be able to like engage differently with the material. Okay, so we're literally concluding now. So literally, and this is just also general notes, right? So no pull throughs. OG can't win because of some things that CG said. Neither can like CO win because of OO. So you can't say like, because OO already won this debate, right? Because they had done this, automatically CO wins, right? CO has to also be weighed based on their unique contribution towards the debate, and hence same thing for like CG, and hence they can't necessarily just be counted on because of their opening teams. What should judges do? They should take notes of material of each speaker, rebuttal, engagement, and they should assess the debate on true and important frameworks, and they should do all 6 comparisons. What this is, right, is that within a debate, and you want to justify maybe who won, right? Maybe you think in this case that, let's just go with the normal order. Okay, so you say OG is last, OO is second. OG, CO is first, CG is second, OO is third and OG is fourth, right? In beginning your comparison, you have to tell us why OG placed fourth. So you have to compare OG to OO, then compare OG to CG and CO, right? So there has to be that bench comparison, there has to be the diagonal comparison, and then there has to be the cross-cutting comparison with the team that's directly opposite it. And then you go next to, I think, if we're saying that OO is third, right? You have to now compare OO to closing government and then compare OO to closing opposition. And then because you had already compared OO to OG, right? You don't have to do that again. And then now you can go into, if CG was third, right? You can be able to maybe compare CG now to CO. And so you can be able to then justify that. And then CO, you compare them to like every team within the debate, right? So in that case, you haven't necessarily looked at teams in isolation and you've compared each of the contributions against other teams' contributions. And that's how you avoid, for example, saying because OG won, CG automatically comes second. What was CG's contribution? How does CG's contribution directly compare to OO's contribution? They can't just come second simply because OG came first, right? Okay. So this is also just in terms of oral adjudication as you come to the end. So you need to follow 4 steps, right? First, you give the ranking. I don't know why adjudicators have developed this bad habit of starting to give notes and starting to give their views before giving rankings. Just give the rankings so that speakers can be able to internalize the feedback based on where they rank, right? So you can say maybe OG is fourth, so that when you're giving like a lot of feedback, right, they can be able to internalize why then they were fourth as you're giving in that feedback. Second, you explain the call, you go chronologically, then you go to the clash points, and then you compare sides. So what clash points generally are, right, is, you remember when you said there's a criteria to which you said maybe the debate was assessed, right? So in this case, maybe OG is fourth. We think that the main clash points within this debate maybe, as were raised by OG, were accessibility, this, and this, and this, and this, and this, right? We think that on this point, right, see, now you begin the comparison, right, with the third team. Then you say, in this case, this OO did better than CG, but than OG in this ways. In this clash, they did better than this in this way. They did better in this way, or this was maybe a stalemate in terms of like there was no clear win in that clash. And then you do the same thing for like all the different sides. And then you can also just generally provide a general feedback. If you feel like the debate was highly unresponsive and speakers are just giving their stances without necessarily rebutting as much information, you can say then that this was a highly like unresponsive debate and this is something that needs to be improved on. Fourth is in terms of inviting speakers to come up for individual feedback. Just this is always a good step, specifically towards guiding speakers as to your rationale, and this can also help specifically with your judging scores, right? Because at the end of the day, judges are also competitors, and so you can be able to like maybe tell them your perspective of how you view things and maybe how they can be able to like better develop. Okay, so judging pitfalls. One is dealing in generalities rather than specificities, right? When you come and say, we thought that closing opposition really brought the case home for us, right? So they won. What case is this? What clash points are this that you weighed them on? How did closing opposition outweigh their opening government? How did they outweigh the opening government? How did they outweigh opening opposition? Its specificity is key specifically, so you can be able to justify which arguments won over others, right? So the role of an adjudicator is highly analytical, so you have to be able to justify based on the criteria that's established. 2 is failing to judge the debate as it happens. So you say proposition never talked about rights in this debate when no one ever engaged the issue of rights, right? It means that you're already coming in with your preconceived notions and you're not an independent voter, right? To that extent. Third is in granting certain classes of arguments undue priority. So only opening government knew the names of major Brazilian cities, closing government won because the arguments are moral rather than practical. So that's like, you see, unjustified metrics. Again, we've talked about how metrics have to come specifically from the prioritization of teams, right? So you say, we looked at this metric because the teams are able to show 1, 2, 3, 4. And even if they don't explicitly say that, right, you have to yield it from like the arguments that they were made, and they can't necessarily be issues such as like, you know, that example of like capital cities or something like that, right? It has to be based on like value additions to the debate. Okay, and lastly is in terms of penalty judging. So your last point came after 6 minutes in your speech, so that really hurt your team. That's not something that you do. That's not something that you penalize. And hence, you just need to have like, you can be able maybe to give it in terms of like constructive feedback as to like how maybe the speaker can improve in terms of getting speaker points. Maybe arrange your points in a way where you bring out your stronger points at the beginning so you can fully be able to analyze them, right? But you don't necessarily but you can't necessarily penalize them, right? That's just something you give in terms of like constructive feedback as to how to improve. Judging on format rather than content, and I think this is the question that Joyce was raising, right? So how do we weigh the format? So you should have put your argument about rights first. Your team was unbalanced. All the good points came from the first speaker. You only spoke for 5 minutes. So it's like, that's not necessarily like substantive kind of feedback, especially when it comes to like the value based of like justifying, right? This is stuff maybe that you can tell a speaker when they come to you for like individual feedback, when they were to ask you maybe, how did you view my speech? Was it slightly more coherent? What can I improve on in terms of structure and those kinds of things, right? But these are not value based, like these are not like value based additions, especially when in considering adjudication. So, and then like swiftly reaching a decision, then finding a justification for it. So it's like we also the debate the same way. So just come to each of us individually for feedback, right? There has to be general feedback provided to all teams so that all teams can receive the same kind of feedback. And I think other than that, that's basically it. I wanted to also briefly just share the, I also just briefly wanted to share the judging scale so that so that judges going forward can be able to familiarize themselves with the scale and know how to give speaker points depending. So just give me 1 second. In the meantime, as I try to find the scale, please feel free to ask any questions. I know we've gone like beyond time, but yes, just feel free. Okay, Prima, actually you can just unmute yourself and ask. I think Prima, just ask your question.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the presentation. My question is in regards to what happens in the deliberation room. For example, how long should deliberation be? Should it be 15 minutes? Should it be 10? And in the instance where we are like just 2 judges and then we are contradicting, like on a ballot, what happens? Does the chair have 2 votes? Or in cases where you're working with a trainee judge, do you disqualify their vote? Basically questions as to what happens in the deliberation room.
So that's a really good question. I think thank you for pointing that out, given the fact that I hadn't. So what generally happens in the deliberation room, right, is that this is where specifically the role of the chair comes in, right? So the role, the chair one has the role to be able to conduct this, has the role to be able to conduct the deliberation. So after the debate is finished, they'll go into the adjudication room. They'll give members of the panel a few minutes to go through the notes and come up with a decision. How BP generally works, right, is that it's a consensus call. So judges have to discuss and come to a call, and then after they discuss and come to a decision, after they discuss and come to a decision, that's when now they can be able to share the call. But again, there are modalities as to how to be able to conduct this. In terms of trainees, right? Trainees are generally individuals who are new to judging, hence they don't contribute to the call at all, but they'll contribute to the conversation surrounding the call, right? So they can say how they saw the debate, but when it comes to maybe voting in a panel, their views don't count, and you can't count a trainee. When it comes to the case maybe where you're 2 members in a panel and one is a chair and you disagree, the chair's vote takes precedence, right? And that's something that has always operated. So the chair's vote always takes precedence given the fact that they have more experience, and that's why they're there as the chair. However, right, when it comes to, you have a stalemate of 1 second. When you have a stalemate and maybe you've discussed it, you haven't yet discussed it and come to a decision, right? you can still be able to either influence the chair and have like a discussive dialogue. But again, at the end of the day, the chair takes precedence if you don't agree on a call. When it comes to what do you call it? When it comes to moderating how things are going to function in terms of the discussion, right? This is usually a skill, right? Especially when you go to outrons and like major panels. So you ask everyone their call, and then you try to list their calls, and then you summarize the key, what do you call them? You summarize the key or the calls that are in common, right? For example, you can be able to see, I think, when you look at a call to a large extent, right? You can be able to see, I think we both agree that OG is last in this case, right? And then maybe you all have CO as first. You can then say, oh, we all have CO first. And then now you discuss the clashes based on how they come in, right? So they can say, and then usually ask the person on the minority, right, to justify why first. So if two members of the panel, for example, all members of the panel have OG fourth, but one member of the panel has OO third, and the other members of the panel have OO second, right? The one in the minority has to justify why OO was third for them, right? And then if they don't manage to convince or sway the other two, it will just be found that on a 2-1 split then that OO is second, right? If they don't justify. If they're able to convince that adjudicator to then move OO to second, then it can function, right? Then they can then be able to talk about why, then after they justify why OO was third, right? And after they finish and then now they've discussed that OO is second, right? They can now discuss why for them CG was third, given the fact that CO is first, right? So then they can be able to begin maybe those conversations, and it's just in a very guided way, right? So get the commonalities. After getting the commonalities, then you begin to evaluate based on the minority votes. Yeah. Okay, so let me try to zoom in quite quickly. So generally the range that exists is between 50 to 100, right? But no one ever really uses 90 and above. No one really ever uses 60 and below. Anyone maybe who's 60 and below, it would mean that maybe that speaker has just come in and not said anything, or hasn't even like stated their name, right? So we don't think anyone competing in a BP tournament is to that extent in terms of the speech, right? But these are all guiding structures as to like the speaker skill. So, but sorry, I think this is not an updated version actually, which is what I'm seeing. And I can't find my updated version. Oh, okay. I'm so sorry about this. Just kidding. Oh, okay. Okay, so let me just share my screen. I was able to find the updated one so we don't risk. No. Okay, yeah, so here it is. So yeah, rarely anyone ever falls within the realm of below 65 generally even, right? So usually that's where the scale sort of begins. So between 70 to 74, this is where arguments are generally like very relevant and some explanation of them is given, but on multiple occasions there may be like obvious gaps in knowledge, right? So usually a lot of like slightly below average debaters fall within 65 to 69, given the fact that like they generally have like mixed statements without necessarily justifying a lot of their argumentation. And then the second scale is usually a lot of beginner debaters where they have some sort of level of argumentation, right? But it's very like simplistic, where they don't necessarily end up proving as much. They just end up like justifying, but at a very low level of argumentation, right? A lot of like generally average speakers, right, fall within the range of like 75 to 79, right? A lot of them actually falling between 75 and 78, where arguments are like almost exclusively relevant, and then they're usually like very persuasive, and they don't have like, but occasionally they might have like certain gaps in explanation, and they might be vulnerable to like some irrelevant arguments, but also not substantially relevant. But also how to know how to classify a speaker, right? Because 75 to 79 is very wide. If a speaker has less logical gaps, right? If they are if they have more relevant argumentation, if they have more like very relevant responses and competent responses, then they fall within maybe the 79 aspect, 78, 79 aspect, right? If they tend to have a lot of gaps, but still like somewhat relevant, right? They can still be within 75 and 76. So it's up to an adjudicator to maybe assess to what level they have deficits and where to group them among the 75 and 79. So also it's important for chairs that when speakers or when other panelists are giving their justification for their speaker scores, right, please make sure they justify why they've given certain ranges of speaker points, so they also don't necessarily end up giving erroneous speaker points. At a world's level, you're asked, why did you give someone a 77? And you have to justify how that suits within, or how that specifically fits within the speaker range, right? So just so they can have a standardized form of judging. So also just for chairs, note that you have to be able to ask for speakers to justify why they give a specific or certain range. So in terms of 80 to 84, I think a lot of like generally good speakers fall within this range. They have like consistently relevant arguments, they address key issues, the speech is clear throughout, and here there are barely any like logical gaps, and a lot of arguments are like sufficiently explained, right? However, there's like, yeah, and there's also like role fulfillment to a certain extent. So and also like a lot of their material is like highly relevant, right? However, like at the end of the day, these speeches are not also like exclusively flawless, right? The arguments don't have like huge logical gaps, but they're still like flaws, minor flaws, I think, specifically when it comes to like the explanation that could have been slightly better in terms of like that could have been like slightly better in terms of like explanation and everything. 85 to 89, I think barely any speaker. A lot of speakers within the continent fall within here. I don't know how many speakers in Kenya fall within this range. I'd like to argue, well, maybe very few, but I think at the end of the day, right, these speeches are like very compelling. Again, these speeches already like in terms of like the structure of the argumentation, you can be able to get the statement, the claim very clearly, the argument, you can be able to then get the analysis and strongly impacted points, right? So 85 to 89, like from the end of their speech, usually you can already tell how relevant their material is, how sufficiently they've impacted a lot of their matter within the debate. And hence it's like usually just a very strong argument because it's like it engages very directly, and it's already very persuasive because they begin to directly engage even with their substantive material. 90 to 94, like, guys, just don't, honestly. At a world's level, maybe they can be able to grant, maybe in the possible future, but I'm not sure if anyone still falls within that range. But so the range you should just stay within is maybe that 65 to 69, maybe going up to 89 at the very most. And also that would be extremely charitable. Yeah, so that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much, Jeff. I think I've taken so much of your time, guys. Thanks for the opportunity.
Right. So we're just about to conclude. So I guess everything is more or less great. We've had an interesting conversation. I hope you guys have been able to pick up different things. Yeah. So just want us to conduct a very like small exercise, and then we're done here. I don't know if anyone has any questions. By the way, this also would be the opportunity to ask. Any questions? Once, twice. No questions. Okay.
One question.
Oh, you have a go ahead.
Yeah. So what happens when the Prime Minister comes and defends the motion? Then the the opposition leader comes and challenges that definition and gives his own definition and justifies why he challenged the definition. So when the deputy prime minister comes, for which definition should they follow? Should they follow the prime minister's definition or the opposition leader's definition?
I don't know if you got that. I think that's directed to you.
So I didn't get that very clearly. I think what I heard is just what happens when the prime minister defines a motion and the definition is questioned by the leader of opposition. I think I just didn't hear the second part. Maybe you can be able to type it so I can like fully address it. But in terms of the first part of the question, I think is always, again, the value judgment, right? How much has the opposition been able to justify why that motion in this case, or why that definition in this case is something that shouldn't be acceptable, why that definition in this case is something that is not necessarily the right definition and the impact that it has towards the debate, right? So you can say that then it makes the debate undebatable, it squirrels the motion, you justify it, right? So it's to what extent then you've been able to justify it, so that what an adjudicator comes and does is that they're able to weigh or assess your justification as to the change in definition or as to the questioning of the definition. Yes.
Cool.
So my question was, if such a scenario happens, should the deputy prime minister follow the prime minister's definition or should they follow the opposition leader's definition?
I think it depends on whether it's very unstrategic already, right? You look like your team isn't necessarily as cohesive in terms of your team stance if you take a different stance. But if you think the opposition's questioning is something that's right? And you think then that you'll fall out of the debate if you don't go with that definition, you can still then be able to go with that definition. But again, it also looks bad upon your team, right? It will be a strategic flaw, but I think you can still be able to continue with the stance of maybe the leader of opposition and continue.
All right. I think you've been answered. I suppose if the recording will be shared, we'll tell you guys how to be able to access it. And the slides as well. We'll have that conversation with Nemo and see whether it's something that we could give access to you guys as well. Okay. So thank you so much for coming this evening. Thank you to everyone. I'm seeing quite a number of, it's like continental representation. I'm seeing Prima, I'm seeing Abigail Elujob. Wow, forgive my horrible East African accent, but yeah, it is what it is. So we thank everyone, Chinidum, for coming from every part of the continent, and generally also for the people who are the locals, like Muchesia, Shamia, Kiragu, Kimani, the local Mwananchi. We thank you for attending the session. I hope you guys have been able to pick 1, 2, or 3 things. Hopefully, the more than 3. But yeah, so it's an amazing activity that we have here. Let's keep doing it now. Hopefully, within the region, there are better calls now from judges. We'll create avenues for you guys to be able to have more conversations on this. But yeah, so from SDS and PUDC, thank you for attending. Have an amazing night, everyone. Goodbye.